On April 2nd, 1999, Carl and Thomas had ventured into the ghost town of Cerro Gordo, abandoned for over 61 years. But as the night unfolded, their adventure turned into a nightmare. What took place that day is truly terrifying, and after 25 years of living in isolation, Carl finally spoke about the incident. This is the story as told by Carl a year before he passed away. This is hard for me to talk about. I cannot forget that day of my life, and it still haunts me. It was the start of spring, and before we left for our respective colleges, we decided to take a hiking trip together. It was Thomas's idea, as he wanted to see the town that was once the notorious killer William Crapo's abode. I admit that Thomas had this weird side to him, where he would delve deep into crime stories and fantasize about them. The interest was more like an obsession. This is probably why he chose the abandoned town of Cerro Gordo. We started at noon from Lone Pine and drove 22 miles to the Cerro Gordo intersection. The ghost town was just 8 miles away from there. Since we planned to camp there for the night, we were not in any rush. We took the dirt road, which was on a gradual elevation. We took our time driving slowly as a cloud of dust formed at every turn. Suddenly, there was a loud bang and I almost lost control of the steering, maneuvering the car like a mad bull. I pressed hard on the brakes and stopped inches away from ramming the car's bonnet into the huge rock on the side of the road. We both looked at each other's faces, breathing heavily. After a few moments, Thomas finally let out a nervous chuckle to ease the mood. He hopped out of the car, and I followed. While he quenched his thirst, I inspected the car for any damage and discovered we had a flat tire. The loud bang we heard was likely the tire bursting after being pierced by a sharp stone. Thomas, still wearing a mischievous look, asked if I thought it was gunfire. I would be lying if I said no, but we had bigger problems to focus on at that moment. Neither of us knew how to change a tire. Thomas didn't know how to drive, and I had just got my driver's license, making me relatively inexperienced. Thomas tried to use his cell phone to call for help, but there was no signal in that area, so we were left to figure things out on our own. 2 hours had passed, and all I had managed to do was remove the flat tire. Just as we were losing hope of finding any help, we noticed someone approaching us on foot. He was a tall man, probably in his 50s. His sharp eyes and deep crow's feet around them indicated he had spent much time under the sun. He wore a cowboy hat and called out to us in a raspy voice from a distance. "Y'all seem a bit out of place here? Need a hand with something?" We were a bit skeptical, but he was our last hope, so we decided to trust him and explained our situation. The man was kind enough to help us replace the punctured tire, and before we knew it, he was all done. He must have seen our sleeping gear in the back seat because his expressions changed, and in his deep, raspy voice, he asked, "You folks planning on spending the night in that abandoned town?" The question was simple, yet it conveyed a mix of fear and concern. I couldn't quite identify the feeling, but it made all the hairs on my body stand. My instincts told me we should turn back and leave. But Thomas had other plans. Excited, Thomas told the man that we had heard a lot of stories about the town and really wanted to see and explore the ghost town for ourselves. The man didn't say a word, and after he had finished helping us, he was ready to depart. We thanked him for his assistance, and as he was leaving, he gave us one last glance. I will never forget the look he gave us, as if he were asking us to reconsider, or perhaps it was something more sinister. Realizing it was already 4:30 p.m., and the sun was already close to setting, we quickly got into our car and proceeded towards our destination. This time, I drove more cautiously. Barely after 20 minutes of driving, we could see the old shack followed by many such shacks that once were homes to the people who lived there. We parked near a rundown structure that must have been a church once, and got down to an eerie-looking town. There was something in the air that made me really scared. But for Thomas, it was a whole new adventure. He hopped from one building to another. The wooden walls were still riddled with bullet holes. Blackened blood on the floors of what used to be a saloon served as a reminder of the murders that took place in the town. Even though it was spring, there was still a little snow left in the upper regions, and it was comparatively cooler. We looked around, and even though the houses were in a dilapidated condition, there were still things that were left behind. We were in one of the houses near the mines when Thomas discovered an old box. It was locked, and Thomas, ever so curious, broke it using a stone. It didn't require much effort as it was rusted. We discovered in the box receipts from the 1850s, letters, an empty locket, a matchbox, and some aged blank sheets. Among the letters, Thomas found a beautifully written love letter to Mary Ann. The cursive handwriting was strikingly beautiful. Experiencing items from a bygone era felt surreal. We carefully returned the letters to the box, but Thomas kept the matchbox as a keepsake. Later, I brought out the tent and began setting it in the open space near a shack. Since there were a lot of damaged wooden structures, some destroyed beyond recognition, we decided to use that wood to make a bonfire. By the time we were done, the sun had set. Thomas brought out a whole chicken that we skewed and placed above the fire. As the chicken was cooking, we sat on the folding chairs we had carried along and enjoyed beer. The place was absurdly chilly, but the warmth of the fire provided us comfort. Even though the crackling of the fire was loud, I couldn't help but notice the sounds I heard from the rundown houses. I looked around many times to figure out where the sounds were coming from, but every time it was a different location, as if someone was playing hide and seek. "Did you hear that?" I asked Thomas, who seemed oblivious to the sounds. "I don't hear anything. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" He shrugged. After 2 beers down, he started recounting William Crapo's deeds. He also had some other stories to tell, which honestly were very depressing. A murder every week made this town the most unsafe place to live in the 19th century. A wave of sadness hit me as I thought about the families of the deceased, particularly the 30 Chinese miners entombed in the nearby mines after a collapse, their bodies never found. The thought of them still lying there, lost forever, sent a shiver down my spine. Soon enough, the chicken was ready, and we enjoyed the food in silence. But I couldn't stop thinking about the incidents. Just then I saw something moving inside one of the houses from the corner of my eye. I turned but saw no one. They were clearly abandoned and inhabitable, yet this feeling of being watched gripped me. We soon finished our dinner and sat near the fire, talking about our plans for the future. Thomas excused himself and went behind the bushes nearby to relieve himself, while I stuffed the leftovers into a disposable bag. Thomas took a while back in the bushes. I called out a few times but got no reply. Again, I heard sounds coming from the shacks. I could swear as soon as I turned I saw a figure in a window, but as soon as I blinked it was gone. All the stories that I heard must have jogged my imagination. Thomas was still not back, so I went to look for him. When I went behind the bushes, I found him staring at a tree trunk. "What are you looking at?" I said to him. I got closer to him and saw the letters WC carved in the wood. I couldn't believe it. Could it belong to the infamous serial killer William Crapo? I turned to look at Thomas and got the fright of my life. He was scowling at me while breathing heavily. I jumped back a few steps. "What the hell, Thomas? It's not funny," I said to him. I thought he was joking, but Thomas continued to scowl at me. His eyes were red, which I assumed was because of the alcohol, but his forehead nerves were bulging and his nose flared as if he were angry. After a few seconds of us staring at each other, Thomas just took off and walked back to the fire. I followed him at a careful distance. He walked straight into the tent without saying a word. It was already 11:30 p.m., so I too decided to retire for the night. I walked inside the tent and found Thomas already in his sleeping bag. He had turned the other way. I got into my sleeping bag, and within minutes I was fast asleep. In the middle of the night, I was woken up by the sounds of children giggling. I looked around, thinking I was dreaming. I looked at Thomas and found his sleeping bag was empty and the zipper of the tent open. I thought to myself that he must have gone to relieve himself, and just when I was about to lay down, I heard the giggle again, this time inside the tent. I panic and look for my flashlight. I find it and turn it on, but as I flash the light inside the tent, I see no one. As soon as I turned off the light, I saw shadows of 2 children running away from the tent. I quickly crawled out of the tent to find no one around. Where did these children come from? I wondered to myself. I tried calling Thomas, but I didn't get any reply. My heart started pounding as the feeling of dread started setting in. I called out to him again, but still got no answer. Where could Thomas go? Just as I grabbed the flashlight to search the wooden houses, thinking Thomas might have gone inside one of those houses, I again saw the shadows of children running inside the mines nearby. Something inside me said to stop there, but my brain said Thomas might have entered the mines. The houses were closely knit, so if Thomas was in any of them, he would have heard me calling. Since there was no reply, I figured he had to be in the mines. I was hesitant to enter, but the thought of being alone outside was even less appealing. So I made up my mind to go inside and look for Thomas. I was scared also because the mines had been abandoned for a long time, and there was no telling when the mines would collapse. But I was ready to take that chance for my friend. I carefully stepped into the mine that looked like no one had visited them in a long, long time. The cobwebs and dripping water carried a gloomy aura. I felt bad for the miners, who spent most of their time inside such a somber place. As I moved forward, I kept hearing whispers, but to keep thinking straight, I reminded myself these were just the sounds of air drafts. The air inside felt heavier, almost pressing against my chest, but I kept moving forward until I saw a flicker of light coming from a connecting tunnel. I thought it must be Thomas, and quickly made my way to the light. I was right. It was Thomas who had lit his lighter and was staring at the walls of the tunnel. I called out to him, but he didn't reply or even bothered to look at me as if I was invisible to him. I walked closer and called out his name again. This time, he turned and smiled at me. Not the smile I was used to seeing, but a menacing smile. He put his index finger on his lips and signaled me to be quiet. I didn't understand why he would do that, but I complied and didn't say anything. He shifted his attention to staring at the walls, and after standing in silence for a few minutes, he spoke. His voice was nothing like I had heard. He hissed and said, "I know you're hiding here. Come out so I can blow off your brains." I stood there frozen. Who is Thomas threatening? Why is he talking like that? What is he about to do? Is there someone with us? Are we in danger? All these questions ran through my mind, and just when I thought I had seen the worst, Thomas took out a gun and shot in the darkness. My ears were ringing because of the loud bang, and then I heard it, Thomas laughing hysterically. I saw his face. He didn't look like Thomas. His bloodshot eyes widened, the corners of his mouth foaming because of laughing so hard. I didn't know Thomas was carrying a gun with him. I flashed my light in the direction he shot and found there was nothing, not even a place to hide. Who was he shooting at? I was shaking like a leaf, but I somehow mustered up the courage to ask him. But when he turned to face me once again, the hollows under his eyes seemed darker, and he hissed, "I'm gonna blow these people's heads. They should have given me the silver when I asked, but now they'll have to pay for refusing." I realized this was not Thomas. He looked possessed because Thomas would never think of hurting anybody, let alone kill. But before I could say anything, he pointed his gun at me, and still smiling menacingly, he growled, "How dare you stare at me?" My life flashed before my eyes as I felt I was going to lose my life. And then he shot me. I fell, and my back rested against the stone wall as the flashlight slipped from my hand. It took me a few minutes to realize he had missed the shot, and the bullet just brushed past my shoulder. Even so, I was bleeding and felt the warm blood soak into my t-shirt. I felt dizzy, but I was alive. I had to get out of there. I lifted my head a little when I noticed a ghostly figure materialize in one corner, and then another specter emerged in the opposite corner. Thomas noticed them too, and turned to face them. More apparitions started appearing, but Thomas laughed even more. Despite the pain, my body went into flight mode, and because of the adrenaline rush, I managed to stand. My legs trembled, but I couldn't risk staying there and losing my life. I saw those apparitions inching towards Thomas, who started firing at them. I grabbed the flashlight and ran without looking back. I kept running till my heart and legs ached. There was just one way out, so I didn't have to think much. The loud sounds of gunshots mixed with shrill laughter followed me for a long time. Finally, I was able to see the entrance of the mine. It was almost dawn when I stepped out. I grabbed my bag and keys but didn't bother to grab anything else and started the car. As I drove off, I could hear the gunshots and see shadows staring at me from the windows of the dilapidated houses. At that point, I knew I had lost my friend to something very sinister. After Carl informed the police what had happened, a unit was sent to investigate the scene. Carl had accompanied them, and was able to guide the authorities to the mine and to the connecting tunnel where he had last seen Thomas, but Thomas was nowhere to be found. The authorities were able to see that only Carl's set of footprints were heading in and out of the mine. They found Thomas's gun, the bullet holes, and his footprints that only led into the mine. What the authorities found disturbing was that they also found multiple footprints of various sizes inside the mine, suggesting a crowd had been there. Thomas was declared missing, and a search operation was launched, but after months of searching, he was never found. Thomas was eventually declared dead. Carl was investigated as the prime suspect, but due to lack of sufficient evidence, the case was declared a cold case. Over time, Carl became a recluse. He only recently came out with the harrowing details of the incident before he visited the Cerro Gordo town one last time. He passed away shortly after. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.